So let's continue on our lecture on African elephants. Now let's talk about conservation actions. What kind of conservation actions can we implement in terms of doing monitoring, recording data, collecting data? So, well, yes, you can. It would be great if you can collect live data, right? Um, in the field by actually directly detecting elephants, but that's going to be harder even for elephants, right? It's because they move constantly, and it's the environment they occupy is quite extensive. So physically observing them, by traveling with vehicles or with planes is going to be quite hard, although it is possible. Um, so because of that, the most of the data collections when it comes to elephants has to happen through passive indirect means, right? So trailer cameras, video cameras, right, that actually record real-time data and then that transmit the data to a from the field into a computer in a research lab is actually kind of a very successful way to get real-time data, to transmit real-time information. Um, and so So that's actually, one kind of a technology. And then to get environmental data, you can actually use deployable data loggers. Well, what kind of things are we talking about here? Well, when you encounter an elephant first, most of the biologists that actually do wildlife tracking, what they do is when they find an elephant, they actually trank it. They shoot a tranquilizer dart, and when the elephant is completely, knocked out, they go there, they put a huge radio transmitter, right, on elephant's collar, like a radio collar around the elephant's neck, which acts. Usually those collars, an elephant collar is pretty much heavy, large for us, but for an elephant, weight of the collar is determined based on the average body mass, body weight of an elephant. So I want you to let you know that. I wish I could show you an actual elephant collar. It's humongous for you and me, but for an elephant, it's nothing. So, and these radio collars actually transmits a signal either to an antenna like you see over here, right, or it transmits a signal to a satellite, right, or to a stationary data towers that actually collects the signals, right, and that signal collected by or transmitted by the radio collar, right, helps you to determine its location, right. um, and if it is directly communicating, if the radio collar is directly communicating with a satellite, that directly helps us determine the location of the elephant. But if it is transmitting from a particular location into an antenna, a mobile antenna, handheld mobile antenna, or to a stationary antenna, then of course you have to kind of triangulate and do some trigonometry to pinpoint where exactly the animal's location is. But either way, that's very basic fundamental level technology that helps you to understand the movements of an elephant, which is extremely important to understand if you want to plan conservation, because you need to know where elephants move, where do they congregate, where do they aggregate, right, where do they move across, what kind of resources they occupy, how that vary across different seasons, right. Where do you find them in summer, where do you find them in monsoon, where do you find them in colder months. So all of that information can be collected by this radio collar based methods, right. So the technology, the seriousness differs. What is the communication link between the radio collar and the receiver, right? If it is a UHF antenna like this, has a very basic technology, right? It's the signal is a VHF or a UHF signal, right? That's kind of a very, back in the early days, that's how actually the TV signals were transmitted, right? And then sometimes they actually use radio signals, right, like a radio frequency, right. And the most advanced technology is actually transmitting a signal, a pulse from the collar to a satellite, right, and that actually goes a long way, and that carries a lot of data. And sometimes some of those radio collars can collect data on the body surface temperature, right. Sometimes they can collect data on the ambient temperature, humidity, um, many other habitat variables that are like climatically related, right. So it's not just the presence of the location, but there are many other accessory data that can be transmitted. So this is actually one of those radio collars that is being connected to an elephant, right? You can kind of see how bad, it's pretty big. And those radio collars are actually battery powered, so you need to frequently replace them. So you have to trank the animal and replace them, right? And again and repeatedly do that. So kind of, this radio telemetry based work is really effective, but it's demands a lot of labor, at least in certain time frames, certain intervals. And like I mentioned earlier, this is actually, the same technology, the very basic technology can be enhanced at satellite level, right? So from the ground level, it actually emits a signal to the satellite. The satellite conveys that signal with a single satellite or multiple satellite systems. It transmits that information coming from the ground into a processing center, and from the processing center, it goes into the research scientist's computer, right? So this data transmission, is actually, involves a lot of data pre-processing, involves a lot of data cleaning, data streamlining. So this whole process is quite expensive to maintain. It's very effective, right? Makes scientific process quite convenient, but it's not cheap, right? And in fact, sometimes if there's no satellite signal, like with the Argos is a company that actually has a satellite system that facilitates this kind of biological, environmental, wildlife data transmission, right? Sometimes they have to actually piggyback with other satellite networks, right? Sometimes they have to communicate with the global positioning system satellites to get an idea about the location, right? And then the Argos satellite communicate with the GPS satellite in order to get an idea about the location of the antennae. So the actual infrastructure is quite complicated and very expensive to maintain it. And also now we have actually other kind of transmitters that can be even deposited inside the animal's body to make some important physiological measurements, right? Like blood pressure, heart rate, pulse rate, internal temperature, right? Or in certain cases, some basic biochemical measurements. But the problem is those kind of internal transponders that you can deposit inside an animal's body requires little bit of an intrusive surgery, and those transponders are not battery powered. So you need to actually get physically closer to the animal in order to facilitate communication between the transpondent and the research scientist, right? But that's another piece of technology that actually has been recently came to surface with the RFID technology. So what are the other ways you can collect data? Well, literally with shit, right? Feces, scat sampling, right? So what does that mean? It's actually you collecting literally shit from the wild, right? In this case, you are looking at somebody collecting elephant dung, right, from the environment, and that is actually, it tells you quite a lot of story, right? You know that wild animals do have two different pores, one for peeing, one for taking the shit, but they do both at the same time. So when you actually collect fecal matter, that is always contaminated with urine. So if it has urine matter in the fecal, in the scat sample, since you get urine, right, you actually can sample that in order to determine the pregnancy, right, or not of a wild animal, right? I mean, this has been applied to elephants, but by all the means, it can be extrapolated to other mammals without a doubt. And most of the fecal matter and the urine samples contain hormones, right? And hormones, if you assay the hormones through some chemical techniques, there are many different techniques, more chromatographic, color chromatographic techniques, liquid chromatographic techniques, to spectrophotometric techniques, and you can identify what hormone is there in what levels, in what relative levels, and then use that to determine the stress levels, because there are certain stress hormones. Some stress hormones indicate short-term stress. Some of them, like steroids, cortisol hormones, indicate chronic stress, right? Actually, steroids indicate reproductive activities, right? Reproductive maturity, and reproductive perceptiveness, meaning like how willing are you to get laid. And then fecal matter also contains a lot of gut parasites, parasitic eggs, different stages of parasites. You can understand the parasitic infections. Now, wildlife will invariably have some load of parasites in it, and that's perfectly normal, and that's most of often doesn't going to harm them. But if there's an increased load of parasites, that's a problem that requires a solution, right? So it reflects the overall health, the overall fitness, the body conditioning of the animal. Food type, well, elephants do not have the best digestive system, right? They are large animals, they are, doing pretty well, but most of the stuff they eat are pooped out partially or poorly digested. So because of that, you can actually, even with very rudimentary techniques as suspending the fecal matter with water, you can actually separate and manually sieve through different food particles and identify what they were eating in relative proportions. And in fact, then well, you don't always have to go through crude techniques. You can actually analyze the DNA in that sample and try to understand, using PCR, quantitative PCR and other polymerase chain reaction based techniques to actually quantify what kind of food items they were consuming, provided that of course we have a good gene bank for the reference purposes, and which we do actually. We thanks to the bioinformatics and and data sciences, we do have actually quite a bit of knowledge about a reference genome to do that kind of comparative studies. And then water stress, right? Like dry feces that are actually freshly laid, dry feces indicates the animal is actually trying to preserve water, right? If there are lots of older aging feces that actually are still moist, you're looking at actually relatively animal that is not having moisture stresses. And in fact, if the animal is having moisture stressful conditions, you find evidence like greater degree of moisture absorption, as well as some hormones production as well, metabolite of hormones in the feces that also helps to determine any kind of a hydrologic stress the animal is suffering from, right? And also thanks to PCR technology and sequencing, right? And to a certain degree the metagenomics, you can actually understand, you can identify individual animals based on DNA present in the fecal. But how so? Well, because when you take a poop, right, you're also shedding cells from your digestive tract as well as from your anus, from your rectum. So you have live cells, right, or DNA in the feces. So you can actually identify into individual animals and then try to understand animal movements based on that. I have read a paper on tigers where they actually used individual fecal fingerprinting to understand movement of tigers. And genetic relatedness, if you get DNA, you can do a whole lot of things. You can understand the population level genomes, right? Whether they are having any kind of a genetic bottlenecking, right? Or are we looking at a genetically diverse population? Are we looking at multiple individuals in a given population? Are they overwhelmingly related to each other? Are there any inbreeding depression going on, right? So with the advent of technology in the world of sequencing, genomics, molecular biology, actually what we can do with fecal sampling has gone from very rudimentary level food analysis to very advanced population level genetics. That's kind of the realm that we are looking at. So in addition to that, what if you can actually collect more live tissues like blood samples? What if you can collect fresh urine, well, and to a certain degree from fresh fecal matter? Yes, you can actually get sex hormones, and that will help you to understand the reproductive maturity of that animal. And in terms of a female, where they are in their menstruation cycles. That's a lot of information that you can gather. That tells you, are they getting ready to impregnate? Have they been impregnated? Are they ready to reproduce, right? Have they conceived, right? Or are they actually lactating? You can learn so much, right, by actually analyzing blood samples, tissue samples, or urine samples, or fecal samples, right? The more biological samples you have, the better your inferences are going to be. And regulatory hormones, for example, like things that regulate your osmotic potential, regulating your mineral potential, right? That tells you about the availability of the minerals and water, right? Cortisols, stress levels, like glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, helps you to understand chronic versus long-term stress. Testosterones, reproductive maturity. Estrogen, progesterone, again, reproductive maturity and the menstruation cycle, right? So, and in fact, in this diagram you are looking at, let me get my pointer over here. It's more visible. In this diagram, we are looking at actually someone demonstrating, a scientist from, can't remember what country she is from. This is actually not the African realm. This is obviously from the Southeastern Asia or Eastern Asia for that matter. There are field-based hormonal assay kits that you can actually use in the field and kind of do some very basic diagnosis in the field, right? And actually sometimes based on the hormone profile, you can actually understand some certain behavioral aspects, right? Are they agnostic or affiliative? So this kind of indirect sampling now I'm talking about, right, can also reveal a lot of information, useful information. Alrighty. Now what kind of conservation actions can we plan? In sub-Saharan Africa, we are talking about African elephants. So sub-Saharan Africa has been quite successful with coming up with this community-based natural resource management strategies that protect, manage, and study and monitor all the form of natural resources, particularly wildlife, because wildlife has been seen as a multi-use resource. Helps to do tourism, particularly African elephant, right? And African elephant is one of the 5 big game hunting animals. So if you have a managed, well-managed game park, if you do hunting in a very regulated manner, it actually helps you manage problem elephants, right, that are older to reproduce, that could be actually creating problems to other elephant herds, right? And it creates a licensing fee. It actually generates so much conservation dollars, right, to support conservation in these less developed countries. So and community-based conservation also opens up the pathway to involve private game lands in conservation, private game lands in tourism, in hunting. Communal lands, meaning lands that are managed by different general public for multiple common purposes like herding and crop management, right? So amongst this communal conservation land, you can actually have some sort of a management strategy to enhance coexistence with wildlife. Well, you can get that if you actually protect enough lands where there will be no cropland raiding. And community-based conservation also encourages local people to become engaged with conservation organizations and scientists, right? I really don't know how well that works. A commoner working with a scientist, I mean, I've heard successful stories in Southern Africa. I'm a little bit skeptic about that because I'm not sure how this, normal people and science can mingle. I'm highly skeptic of that as a scientist. You can blame me all you want, but I want to be objective and mention that there are objectively successful stories where local communities that actually used to be a problem causing for conservation, that actually known to be hunters, known to be poachers, known to be exploiters of natural resources, have ultimately become the guardians or the protectors of that by becoming a game warden, as you can see in these diagrams, right? So and here actually it's a picture from Save Valley Conservancy in Zimbabwe, where 2 game guards actually made arrests on poachers, right? And also here's an instance where actually they do farming, right? These large melons, like humongous melons growing inside a multi-purpose conservation lands. And this is actually an baobab tree, also known as a bottle tree, right? That's actually, it's a very funny looking tree where it looks like the tree has been uprooted, right? This is actually the branches and the crown, but it looks like a root, right? And this is actually the root, but it looks like the crown. It's kind of like in the soil. And this is an instance where a wildlife interpreter is kind of talking about natural resources to tourists. So promotes ecotourism. Community-based conservation have led to increases in ecotourism, decline in exploitation-based ventures, and increase in sustainable resource use, and also creating more job opportunities that are not exploitative or sustainability based. And community-based conservation is said to redistribute benefits rather than concentrating benefits on a handful of individuals, right? Different types of jobs like tourist lodge management, campsite management, game guides, tourist guides, as well as to handcraft production, right? And also opportunities for providing training opportunities for game wardens, for park managers, right? And also a game meat, um, or bushmeat being actually kind of redistributed as a staple food, right? Instead of farmed animals, right? And also there are some evidence actually with the development of community-based conservation. It led to enhancement of tourism, that led to development of better infrastructure, which led to better schools, better education levels, better access to key human needs. And also, community-based conservation creates job opportunities for monitoring wildlife, for reporting violations, and provision of needs like personnel and vehicles, right? Field officers to maintain these activities, as a kind of an operational center. Equipment purchase, including like firearms, binoculars, or any other device that you require for monitoring. Um, and of course, that has created cross-cultural collaboration, because African nations are actually quite diverse. They are, even the indigenous tribes have diversity amongst them, right? And of course, then with the European colonization, you have this European ancestry, right? Multinational European ancestry, particularly in Southern Africa, Southern African environments. You have this German-based ancestry, English-based, Dutch-based, ancestry, and to a certain degree you wouldn't believe that there is actually like South Asian ancestry, particularly with the colonial period. There were lots of people being moved here and there around, so this kind of activities actually enhances that cross-cultural collaboration, which leads to sharing indigenous knowledge as well as scientific knowledge. Again, indigenous knowledge, you have to take it with a grain of salt. Some of them are extremely useful, some of them are very objective, some of them actually have a very good scientific basis, but there's quite a lot of bullshit there. So cross-cultural collaboration, knowledge sharing, indigenous knowledge, it's great, but make sure the indigenous knowledge is not bullshit, right? Particularly if it is contaminated with religious beliefs, cultural taboos, you are going to have bullshit. So you have to make sure that the science plays a predominant role when you let this kind of knowledge sharing happen. Um, and then this kind of community-based conservation led to zonation the of the lands. Certain lands, extensive lands, committed for crop farming. Certain ones for grazing as rangelands. And some of lands for game management, meaning managing wildlife for hunting, right? And some of them no hunting, just for tourism. Some of them just for conservation. Like that, you can actually have effective zonation where there's enough lands for conservation, enough lands for managing game animals, enough lands for farm production. So because of these kind of efforts, particularly because of this community-based conservation efforts, which involves both communal and private lands, right? In Namibia, right, they have nearly half of their lands protected, right? Within that 50%, within that, like, when I actually made this PowerPoint a few years back, it was over 40%, and it has been since increasing. So I believe it's close to 50% now. The state-owned conservation lands is only 17%. The rest of the over 30%, right? Nearly 40% is actually combination of private and communal lands, right? So the government's role is minimal. In that way, government can concentrate better on protecting their state lands, and usually those states lands are larger national parks, so they actually require a lot of input, logistic input and financial input. So it's good, they can actually have concentrate their resources and also help the communities, the communal lands and the private land managers manage their own lands more effectively. And also this kind of effectively increased the acreage of conservation land, so that actually helps movement of wildlife from a problem environment to another. For example, I mentioned that state conservation lands receive the most protection, so because of that, quote unquote, there is a chance of overpopulation where the actual animal population gets closer to the carrying capacity. That could create some problems because most of the protected areas could actually be resource poor for some other reasons. So in that case, you have to translocate those animals, right? So now with the communal conservation lands, you can translocate those animals from overpopulated. I really hate using the word overpopulated, but that's the easiest way to say this. From overpopulated areas, or from healthy populations, from growing populations, to those sparsely populated communal lands. So it helps you to do in form of reintroductions from in terms of wildlife translocations. Has been quite successful in the southern Africa. And that has been even done from South Africa to Namibia, from South Africa to Botswana to Zambia, right? So it has been quite successful. And in fact, in Southern Africa, the conservation needs in different countries like South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, they're quite similar, right? Angola, they're quite similar. So there is actually a growing interest to work together to promote wildlife conservation. So one of the coolest things that they have came up with is this transboundary conservation actions, right? Where conservation happens across political boundaries, right? So there are many examples for that. I don't have enough time to go over all of them. Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. The place you see in this map, right, is actually one of the largest transboundary conservation lands, transboundary protected areas. It spans across Namibia, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, right? That's 5 countries, right? In fact, the resource input goes beyond these 5 countries. South Africa actually made a huge commitment for planning this particular protected area. And look how effective it is. Can you see the green patches in that map? Those are the state park network in each country, right? See the boundary that is encircled by the Transfrontier Conservation Area, and see the actual state-sponsored protected area. So most of the protection that is afforded with the Kavango Zambezi, well, it's in short it is called KAZA, K-A-Z-A, right? The first 2 letters of the Kavango Zambezi. Because of the KAZA conservation area, right, you actually doubled the effective conservation lands, right? Which actually increases the protection afforded to each state protected area, each national park, right? And increase the protection that existed in communal lands and private lands. So this effort, I said, has manifested all over the southern African continent. In fact, this has been attempted all over the world. It has been mostly successful, at least in terms of implementation, in southern Africa. Funny enough, it fits very it fits quite well in the Congo Basin in the Central Africa. Didn't work. It was shit, right? It was an utter failure. It was, overwhelming amount of corruption. But in southern Africa, I'm not saying it's not without problems. I'm not saying it's not without gimmicks. It worked to a certain degree, right? This is happening. Many similar efforts are actually popping up elsewhere, as you can see in this particular map, right? And that's actually a couple of important locations I'm highlighting over here. KAZA, by surface area, it's over 200,000 square miles, right? The one that is in number 7 is actually a coastal desert, which itself makes it unique. In fact, it's one of the most biodiverse coastal deserts, Namib Desert, that spans between Angola and Namibia, right? What is important about that? There is a plant, one of the only living monocot plants occurs in that particular desert, right? Welwitschia, right? You might have heard about that name when you are taking your Bio 122 lectures. A very healthy lion population. Matter of fact, the healthiest desert lion population occurs there, right? Elephant population occurs there. Desert elephant population occupies that Namib Desert. It's a very unique environment, extremely dry desert, but rich in wildlife, right? Conservation of which is only effective if you promote transboundary conservation, that linking Angola and Namibian coastal environments to protect the Namib Desert, a unique ecoregion in itself. So Transboundary conservation ensures that the protection is not limited by political boundaries. You can protect landscapes. That is a landscape. Namib Desert is an ecoregion. It's not a country, not limited by a country. It's saddles across countries, right? And helps you to protect different land cover types. So you can actually protect different vegetation zones, right? And protect environmental gradients. The greater the land you protect, the more effective you become at preserving ecological processes. Um, and also, you can this transboundary conservation is one of the most effective tools you can use to protect natural resources that are of mutual international interest, like watersheds and savannas, right? Savannas such as the Serengeti plains between Tanzania and Kenya, right? Um, that conservation efforts can only take place if the two countries come together, and which they did, which they are. Um, and watersheds, right? There are many rivers that actually crisscrosses, these multiple nations, even in southern Africa. In southern Africa, protecting watershed is all the more important, right? Well, the same thing can be applied to Central Africa, but like those fucking idiots are never going to get their shit together for to do meaningful things. So I'm not going to talk about that. And and then the greater the land you have, more habitats you have to protect wildlife and animals, right? Actually, that re-establishes migratory patterns. In southern Africa, migration happens always across the boundaries, right? It's kind of heavily understudied, right? Particularly with some of the radio telemetry work that has been done on leopards, large carnivores, and on elephants have actually revealed this pattern. If you look at the eastern part of Africa, right, Serengeti plains has been used by migration of wildebeest and many other large mammals. So transboundary conservation rekindles these, large migratory patterns, migration processes, and migration is extremely important part of those animals' life cycles. It re-establishes connectivity at landscape scale, right? And in fact, elephants can be used to prop up, like there's kind of a feedback mechanism. Transboundary conservation helps to protect elephants. Why? Because elephants are wide-ranging animals. They require multiple habitat types. They require multiple land use land cover types. They require to associate different vegetation types. They are dependent on many ecological processes, right? And they have large home ranges. They have seasonal variations of their biological needs. So yes, landscape scale conservation matters to them. At the same time, you can use elephants as a charismatic species. It's a beautiful animal. Everyone wants to protect elephants, right? It's an important flagship species. It embodies it's an embodiment, right? It's a paragon of African wildlife, right? And even hunters want to protect it because they want to hunt something, right? If you kill all the elephants, what the hell are they going to hunt? So there are multiple interests, multiple reasons to protect elephants. So you can actually use transboundary conservation to protect elephants, and you can use elephants to promote transboundary conservation. So there is kind of a bilateral, bidirectional partnership emerging there. Okay. We are at our last slides, right? So what are the activities you can actually implement in terms of preventing raids? So I earlier mentioned about this fencing of protected areas. I don't know how effective that is, right? Because yeah, when you first build fences around protected areas, elephants are smart animals, and of course like electrify the fence, but animals are going to learn. So they will actually figure out when it is, the electric pulses are not transmitting all the time, right? There's a time you can effectively kind of break it, right? And sometimes certain elephants actually put logs or other weights on it and collapse the fence. And sometimes one elephant can push another elephant towards the fence and keep pushing it, so that using the one elephant as the buffer or the shock absorber, and kind of push down the fence. The electric current is not that powerful, right? So it's not like the shock is going to come through one elephant and hit the other. Remember, these are four-legged animals, right? So if one elephant is touching the fence, right, the electricity is going through the elephant to its 4 feet rather than to another animal. So it's not like you touching someone electrocuted, like it's not like that. So essentially putting fences around protected areas, not a good thing. It wouldn't work, right? But maybe you know what you wanted to have a fence around fucking stupid people. So if there's a farm, if there is a village, put a fence around them, right? Like people deserve to be in cages. Animals do not, right? So I leave it there. Can you have a natural fence, like not an electric fence, right? Unless you're putting it around people, sure, but not around wild animals. Wild animals should not have any hindrance to their movements, right? Because they belong to that environment. We don't. Um, so it has turned out that bees, presence of bees, African native bees or, like European honeybees, well, better if it is the African native bees, who are, by the way, a little bit more aggressive, right? Which includes the, like particularly because of their bee buzz, it is known to repel elephants, right? So scientific studies have shown in recent years that a fence made out of actual bee colonies can be an effective barrier, even profitable barrier, that can actually helps you A, to keep away the elephants and save your crop, B, extract the honey and sell it up in the market. So you're actually making money out of a fence, right? The brilliant yet simple and profitable strategy. Simply what you're doing is you actually have an open fence. You just hang bees, right? And trust me, no elephant is going to like cross that boundary, right? And this effect, like I don't think still we should put this around protected areas. Put this around people's village or around the houses. That's a better idea. And in that case, if something happens, it's people who are going to suffer from a bee sting, not animals. And in fact, usually they even have figured out like how frequently do you require these kind of hives. If you hang a hive at every 10th meter, that seemed to be effective enough, right? So, and in fact, what they do is, like, I don't know whether we can effectively see it over here, right? Here actually they have these, like these beehives in, different distances. What you can do is actually you can link those hives in between those 10-meter gaps. So if an elephant tries to cross it, they actually trigger the wire, that trigger the hive, and that actually makes the elephant like kind of go back. So, and then, of course, how about creating certain natural, like growing natural trees that actually kind of creates a physical barrier that prevents elephants from crossing? That would be also effective, right? And then, of course, um, I will come to that law later on. No, maybe it's actually about the time to talk about that law. CITES, Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species. There is actually a video uploaded on this particular topic into the Blackboard page, so please do go ahead and read it. You're required to listen to that regardless of my advice. These kind of international conventions to prevent, mitigate, minimize endangered species, minimize the trade of endangered and threatened rare species is actually quite important. What does CITES do is it actually lists different categories of animals that actually certain animals completely prohibited from international trades, meaning like you cannot cross international borders with a product of that animal or a live animal of that, right? So like some in certain schedules, the level 1 schedule, nope. Like most of the critically endangered animals or animals that are in danger of becoming endangered, right, are lists in the schedule 1. And then there's like, actually there are 4 scheduled. In the tier 2 schedule, you actually have like kind of a permitted exchange. For example, like, I mean, what if you will not, in schedule 2, for example, no commercial trade is permitted, period, but you allow trade as long as that trade involves scientific purposes, right? Schedule 3, well, it allows a trade for conservation purposes, right? For example, like, trading or exchanging animals in between zoos, in between different protected areas, right? So, and then, like to schedule 4, you have some, limited monitored transaction going on whenever the population is not in danger, when there is a possibility of doing sustainable consumption, then you can actually have animal listed in that group. So there are different levels of listing of species that are endangered, rare, or threatened, where the International Convention provides variable restrictions for transactions of these animals across international borders. Now, we don't have any elephants in the US, but can US contribute to preventing ivory thefts, preventing poaching, right? Particularly in terms of elephants, yes. Particularly with respect to elephants, there are 22 states that have taken steps towards protecting both species of elephants, right? In this particular map, you are looking at states with a blue color. They actually have laws passed, right? Um, and the states with green color, those are the states where you actually have laws passed, right? Um, the laws are being drafted successfully, being introduced. The enactment is in progress, right? And then there are certain states where the legislation was introduced, but it did not go any further, unfortunately, right? So those states can actually try again with certain variations. There's a reason that they have been failed, right? And then of course in certain states there are certain ongoing efforts, right? But unfortunately, vast majority of the states don't give a fuck, right? I mean, that's what you see, because most of the states appear in gray, meaning they have no concerns of conservation, right? Screw them. um, so yeah, I mean, US government actually does have, a strong role in this, because um, some of the studies on ivory stockpiling shows that US does have a substantial amount of ivory stockpiling, right? That's actually not, like gathering ivory. That is actually the ivory that is collected through raids and custom services, right? So there is some sort of, individuals that are engaged in um, ivory traffic, right? That actually, and some of those crosses through US international US borders. So there is a responsibility of the United States to get involved in mitigating this problem, right? And then of course federal agencies, like US Fish and Wildlife Service, right, which can introduce laws within the United States that will support conservation efforts elsewhere or in the United States to minimize these internationally significant um, for the protection of species with an international significance, particularly for the so-called charismatic species, umbrella species, right? And African elephant conservation is something the US has been focusing on for quite a long time at federal level. The previous map was at state level. And also, I'm not going to go into detail about the last thing I'm showing. It's actually an immunocontraception technique that has been used to reversibly neutralize reproductive capacity of elephants, right? So it's actually it's introduced through a vaccine that is actually like injected to the elephant via a dart gun, right? So what it essentially does, it prevents, as you can see, the green thingy actually prevents penetration of the sperm through zona pellucida into the cytoplasm of an ovum, right? Now that bond between the contraceptive blocker um, or this temporary block created by the bonding between the ovum and the contraceptive drug is not permanent. It is reversible by a second drug, right? Or sometimes actually with time the contraception degrades, so they can so the fertilization can take place. So this method you can introduce whenever there is an overpopulation, right? So again, has been quite successful. So science actually helps a lot to mitigate human wildlife conflicts, and it has done quite a lot and can do a lot in future. Well, with that, I'll wrap up my lecture. Hope you guys enjoy, and good luck with your own presentations. Bye bye.